The age of American imperialism occurred during the 30-year period from 1890 to 1920 and was a crucial period in the development of the United States as a nation today. During this time period, the United States sought to expand its influence and control over the land and territories of Central and South America, as well as open up new trade opportunities and create trade partnerships with the countries of Japan and China in Asia. Through its efforts, the United States would gain important territories and lands that would be added to the country, as well as improve its economic standing and influence throughout the world. By the conclusion of the Age of Imperialism and the end of World War I, the United States would position itself to be one of the most important countries in world events. The concept of imperialism is best defined as the belief in the importance of a nation building an empire. Similar to the dark side or the empire in Star Wars, an empire was a group of territories that were owned or controlled by one country or central government. Imperialism is also recognized as a situation where one country attempts to control the lives, land, economy, or resources of another nation through its foreign policy. Attempts to control these aspects of life in another country and dictate the events that are occurring are known as the foreign policy of interventionism. Imperialist countries typically had four goals that they hope to accomplish through their actions. Imperialists hope to gain control or access to trade and valuable resources. They hope to create markets for selling the goods that they were producing in their own countries. They hope to spread and promote their culture and way of life to new people and new nations. And they hope to create military alliances with foreign countries that would help them protect and defend their nation and their citizens who were traveling abroad as part of their imperialist efforts. Nations that were able to successfully accomplish these goals typically benefited through economic improvement and increased standing throughout the world. The age of American imperialism specifically occurred from 1890 to 1920. Other nations had taken imperialist actions in Africa and Asia before the United States became involved. But by the late 1800s and early 1900s, the United States had increased its wealth and influence as a result of its improvement during the Industrial Revolution, and had finally claimed and settled all of the territory within the nation's borders. This led to the United States taking the ideas of manifest destiny, expansionism, and the Monroe Doctrine, which had dictated American events during the period of westward expansion, and applying them to areas outside of the country. Leading up to the Age of Imperialism, the United States believed in the idea of manifest destiny. It was our nation's policy that we should expand and control all of the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This was an example of the concept of isolationism, and that we wanted to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. We did not focus on world events or become involved in world events, and we hoped to keep other nations out of U.S. territory. During this time, the United States also practiced expansionism, as Americans moved west and settled the land within our borders. Once the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific had been settled and divided into what would eventually become the 50 states, or correction, the 48 states, America sought to look outward beyond its borders to gain additional territory, such as Alaska and Hawaii, the two states that would be added to make the 50 states that are currently part of the United States. The United States also hoped to enforce a policy known as the Monroe Doctrine, which was developed by President James Monroe and promoted the idea that Europeans should stay out of the events and issues in North and South America. America pledged to take on a role in policing world events in the Western Hemisphere in exchange for Europeans keeping their influence out of this area of the world. As you can see from the map in the picture, the United States progressively expanded its territory through the addition of land such as the Louisiana Purchase in the center of the country, which was added in 1803, through the annexation of Texas and the Mexican Cession, which were added in the 1840s and 1850s, through the addition of the Oregon Country, which was added in the 1850s and 1860s, and then ultimately territories outside of the United States, such as Alaska, Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and other U.S. territories. Once the American Industrial Revolution occurred, America began to focus on gaining and controlling land in foreign countries in order to gain access to the resources that were needed to continue our industrial development. Having access to natural resources such as coal, oil, rubber, and other items that were important to the developing industries of the American economy forced the United States to look outward to get these resources. The age of American imperialism would ultimately go on to include the foreign policy decisions of 4 U.S. presidents, beginning with William McKinley in 1896, following him Teddy Roosevelt, who took over after McKinley's assassination and continued many of his policies in Central America, and then eventually William Howard Taft, and the final president of the age of imperialism, Woodrow Wilson, who would lead America into World War I. Through their actions, these 4 presidents gained valuable pieces of land and increased America's standing in the world. Most of the actions of the age of imperialism involved foreign policy decisions made by the presidents previously mentioned. Under the rules of American government and the Constitution, our foreign policy decisions involve multiple people. Today, the President, the Secretary of State, members of Congress, specifically the United States Senate, the U.S. military, and then the foreign countries and their leaders that we are attempting to work with collectively decide the foreign policy decisions that our nation makes. When approaching foreign policy, nations typically have 3 basic approaches. The first approach is violent foreign policy. This involves conflicts such as war, disagreements, making threatening gestures or actions towards countries, and usually results in the concept of militarism, or the building up of military forces and the use of those forces to defend a nation, to fight a war, to conquer a foreign nation, or to use the threat of force to create a balance of power and force other nations to act in ways that are in your benefit. The second major approach to foreign policy involves peaceful relationships, such as alliances. Alliances such as the formal agreements of the Triple Entente, Triple Alliance, and the Balkan alliances that were made leading up to World War I, grouped nations together in order to protect themselves from foreign aggression. Following World War II, the United States, along with many other world nations, joined an international organization known as the United Nations, in which the countries of the world attempt to peacefully coexist and solve problems collectively as a group of connected nations, instead of each nation influencing world events through their own individual foreign policies. Alliances are typically used to prevent war or to create relationships with countries that want to work together. The last method of foreign policy are what is known as diplomacy. This includes negotiating agreements and treaties with foreign countries, as well as agreements for economic aid and relief, such as humanitarian aid, food and medical supplies that are given to other countries, trade relationships and partnerships, or collectively working on common problems. A modern-day example of diplomacy and economic aid would be the U.S. distribution of COVID-19 vaccinations and other disease prevention efforts that we are involved in throughout the world. Through these actions, we are not only helping foreign countries, but we're creating alliances and partnerships where we can work on problems collectively that benefit both nations. Ultimately, whether a nation conducts peaceful foreign policy through alliances or international organizations and diplomacy, or through violent methods such as war and militarism, a nation is able to influence the events of foreign countries and hopefully promote actions that are in the benefit of both nations. While this is not always possible, it is the goal of most modern foreign policy today. The age of imperialism for America involved 6 or 7 major world events that the United States became involved in. As we go throughout the unit, we will look at each one of these events in detail. But the events of imperialism begin with the opening of Japan in 1854 by Commodore Matthew Perry, and the trade relationship that it began with the people of Japan. The opening of Japan was followed shortly thereafter by the purchase of Alaska, also known as Seward's Folly, in 1867, and the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, as both of these new territories would eventually become U.S. states. Military conflicts such as the Spanish-American War in 1898 were also a part of American imperialism. The U.S. also became involved in the events in China when an event called the Boxer Rebellion occurred and Chinese citizens attacked U.S. and European citizens who were in China, and ultimately led to the creation of a trade relationship known as the Open Door Policy, which began in 1900. The U.S. would also be influential in Latin America with the creation of the Panama Canal from 1903 to 1914, and the control of the Panama Canal up until the year 2000. Lastly, the U.S. would become involved in the Mexican Revolution of 1910 in an effort to influence the events and help certain Mexican revolutionaries take control of the Mexican government. In all of these instances, America became involved in a world event for the purpose of benefiting our country. Through the actions, America expanded its influence over these new territories, was able to gain land and economic benefits, and ultimately became an influential voice in world events. Through the major events of imperialism, and as a result of the foreign policy decisions made by Presidents McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, the United States took on a much more significant role in world events. We began to invest millions of American taxpayer dollars into the development of foreign nations. In most instances, this money was directed towards leaders and industrial development that would benefit the American economy. The United States became significantly more involved in world events and the decisions that were being made. Our influence over the territories of Latin America and the Caribbean islands increased significantly. As a result of the impacts of imperialism, the American population became divided over whether or not we should be taking on this new role in the world. While many Americans saw the benefits of interventionism and the role that the United States could play to improve its standing in the world, a significant chunk of the population hoped to remain isolationist and pull back from being involved in these events. Isolationists typically argued that we needed to focus on the issues and problems of our country before we attempt to resolve issues in foreign countries. The United States would add several new territories and states to the original land that it controlled. We would create a number of rivalries and alliances that would become important to future world events following World War I and World War II. And after World War I and World War II were over, America put itself in a position to be one of the leading world powers and have a significant impact over the foreign policy events of the late 1900s and early 2000s. Ultimately, the age of imperialism dramatically changed America's standing in the world, its role in world events, and its position as a global leader in both business and trade, as well as foreign policy decisions and conflicts.